Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So I first met Maurice in 1979. I came up for an undergraduate admissions interview to read the maths tripos, and that seemed to go quite well. But I was really interested in computers, and I had an afternoon spare, so I thought I would try and find the computer laboratory. I found the tower, and it's unmarked and an imposing entrance. And I climbed to the first floor, thinking there might be a reception where I could perhaps ask more information. Just a corridor of offices, all the doors shut. So I went up one more floor and found this door that said head of department. And so I went in, and there was another door that said Professor M.V. Wilkes, head of department. And I was a fearless young man, schoolboy really. So I knocked on the door. And this voice said, "Come," and I went in and introduced myself. Now, Professor Wilkes was very tolerant of my intrusion, and we chatted away for a little while. I asked him why I couldn't read computer science in the first year here at Cambridge. It was a 2-year course then, you had to do something else in the first year. He said, "Do the maths, it'll be good for you," and he was very right about that. I said I was interested in electronics and building computers, and that I'd recently built one. And with a very wry smile, he said that he had built one himself a little while ago. The next time I met him was in 1982, and he was back from DEC for a short holiday back in Cambridge. And that summer I was working for Andy Hopper and Acorn, doing some CAD design or designing some part of the ring chips. And I was sat in the terminal room next to the Titan room, and Maurice came in. I recognised him instantly, but of course he didn't recognise me. He sat down and tried to start doing his email and became stuck. So he asked if I could help him, which I did. I got him going again. He thanked me very much, paused for a moment, and asked me if I'd built any more computers. Maurice had a very good memory, and he was very interested in people. So when Olivetti acquired Acorn Computers in 1986, Herman Hauser became the Vice President of Research at Olivetti, and he was responsible for their research laboratories worldwide, which at the peak was some 7 or so. In 1986, Herman and Andy Hopper started the Olivetti Research Lab here in Cambridge, universally known as ORL, and Andy was its managing director. The mission of the lab, which was largely self-determined, was to investigate advanced digital networking and its applications. The method was to build real systems which were complete enough to be deployed on fairly large scales, and their use and properties evaluated in practice. Maurice had just returned from DEC, where he'd thoroughly enjoyed his time, as obvious from Don's talk. And he was keen to continue working in some capacity. Retirement, I don't think, was ever on his mind, or certainly not at that time. And really, the timing couldn't have been better. And Herman and Andy approached Maurice to join them at the lab's first offices at 4A Market Hill, which he was delighted to do and did so on a full-time basis. His role was that of an advisor, counsel, and general wise old bird. And he was styled staff advisor on research strategy. Now at 73, he no longer really expected an operational role, though in those early days he did occasionally just forget the difference. But he always knew when he'd gone too far, and he was also always graceful after the event. However, within a very short time, a very productive lab was formed, and some of the bright stars from the computer laboratory had been recruited. And Maurice's input into the strategy, the direction, the process, and the culture of that lab were extremely valuable and much appreciated. And his importance couldn't be underestimated to Olivetti. An eminent figure assisting in the research laboratories could not be overstated. He added experience and wisdom and a gravitas, which were the qualities that Olivetti as a parent company appreciated. He was enormously well connected and made many, many useful introductions, helping to establish the reputation of the lab, and gave it credence by his presence. But of all Maurice loved being in a lab culture. We loved having him there, and he was fascinated by the possibilities of the high-speed digital network systems that we were building. He was a voracious user and ready critic of everything that we did for the next 16 years. So one of the lab's first projects was Pandora. This was a digitally networked multimedia system. It was an enhanced workstation which provided video conferencing, video mail within our lab, but also within the university. It was a joint project, so there were Pandora setups in the computer laboratory. Maurice and Roger used to chat away very frequently over this system, and perhaps two of the system's most frequent regular users. Pandora didn't always work exactly as intended, and here's a clip rescued from the archive showing a video mail from Maurice to Andy Hopper about such a failure.
Andy, in Reed, I just had a XP transfer call from Roger, and he didn't tell me who it was. It described him as a question mark, which I think you would agree falls rather short of any proper description of Roger.
So Maurice could be a little pernickety, but only in a wholly positive sense. It was valuable feedback. He appreciated attention to detail. He knew how important that was in a working system. It's undoubtedly something that was part of his approach and something that I think we all learnt from. And it's something that we've tried to follow. Another project from those early days was the active badge system. By now the lab had relocated to the old Addenbrooke site on Trumpington Street. It was a great development that Maurice was fully behind. With more staff and larger premises, we had the problem of knowing who was at work, where they might be, how to contact our colleagues. We solved it ourselves with the active badge system, which tracked people around the building. So the officers had infrared sensors and people wore badges, like this one. This is actually Maurice's real badge from the archive, so that's an artifact for today. The data was collected and made available to all of us through a number of applications. Again, Maurice was a very keen user, saw many benefits in this kind of system, improving communications with colleagues. However, he was very keen on privacy, his own personal privacy, and he insisted on a master switch being installed in his office, which would cut off both the Pandora and the active badge systems in one fell swoop. We duly provided him with such a switch, a rather large, comical, wall-mounted switch, but he understood the gentle humour of that, and it wasn't lost on him. He was scathing about the interpretations of the badge data sometimes. So when we tried to be a little bit too clever, and when 3 or more badges were in the same place, we said that was a meeting, Maurice said this was nonsense. It was nothing of the kind. It was simply 3 badges in the same room. There may or may not be 3 people attached to the 3 badges. And even if there were 3 people, they might be sleeping. He was, of course, right, but on balance, we left that message in, but he never ceased to tease me about artificial intelligence in that context. He was very quick to see the potential of this system as a tool to discreetly manage his own interactions with his colleagues. Maurice could occasionally be a little grumpy in the mornings, perhaps too much port in college the night before, something like that. So he used to come into work, but he didn't put his badge on, and when eventually he was fired up and ready for business, ready for visitors, he would put on his badge to signal this, and we knew we could visit him, and his secretary would come in with the first coffee. But even though he was occasionally grumpy, he was never unkind. This is a splendid photograph of Maurice with David Wheeler and Roger. It was taken on Don's his PhD graduation in 1992. Don had been given time off for good behaviour from DEC and had come to do a PhD in the computer lab. Now, at this time, Olivetti were keen to widen the participation in the laboratory, both in a way of sharing the funding costs, but also as a means of introducing other substantive partners into the mix who might work jointly on some of our initiatives. It's probably no surprise, given the connection with Don then, that at this time ORL was 25% funded by DEC. Maurice was extremely helpful on these occasions. All of his connections were brought to play, and his help during the changes and transitions in funding were very, very important. We had a great visits with DEC. It was a very productive time, very warm welcome and thought-provoking interactions when we visited the labs. For our part, we put the badge system into places like the DEC SRC lab in Palo Alto and the Cambridge lab as well. Maurice and Roger thought this was fantastic and enjoyed turning up at these labs with their own Cambridge badges and finding that they just worked, and that we'd also managed to exchange the data in real time between all of the sites around the world. So Maurice could always find Roger when Roger was there during one of his many summer visits to DEC SRC. At DEC, Maurice had become very accustomed to emailing on his DEC workstation using X Windows. Although he was never more than a two-fingered typist, he nevertheless attended to all his own email and was in constant touch with colleagues and friends around the world. Enjoyed being able to email them at different times. Out of office hours, he also wanted to keep doing email, so our first approach was to install a DEC workstation at his home, but this was a little bit cumbersome and inconvenient for that environment. But our teleporting and VNC project provided a neat solution to it. It was a remote access system, so we could install a simple PC in his home, and he could connect back to his office machine just as if he was there. We eventually hooked up this to the badge system as well, so you could just click your button and your desktop would pop up. And we put one of these badge sensors in Maurice's home too, so in effect his home became a part of the lab and its infrastructure. We decided to open source the VNC component of this project, and he was most curious about that. And I remember discussing with it at length with him. He could see the enormous possibilities of open source, of seeding an opportunity that you might perhaps commercially be able to harvest later, and was always encouraging when we did things like this. So here's another project. A later and more ambitious one was a foray into digital network multimedia, the Medusa project, with our own ATM network and peripherals like cameras and audio and storage and analyzing engines. We built a very sophisticated video conferencing and video mail system. Once again, Maurice was a very willing guinea pig and used the systems with great relish. So here's another clip.
One of the people who has a Medusa system in his office is Maurice Wilkes. And we'll call him on the Medusa video phone. Hi, how are you?
All right, thanks. Good.
Not so bad. So we're taking this film of Medusa and illustrating how the multiple screens can be used. Do you find them useful at all?
Oh, yes, I think so. It's good to have more than one view to choose from.
How would you compare that to the hands-free CD quality audio where you can hear a pin drop almost at the other
Oh,
end?
that's very nice. The higher quality audio is definitely worthwhile. Something I think we lack in ordinary radio and TV.
So Maurice and Andy had adjacent offices, and their desks were arranged either side of a thin partition wall in such a way that effectively they were facing each other. And we were all amused, including Andy and Maurice, I think, to think that they would speak to each other every day using this system, when in fact a hole in the wall would have sufficed. On one occasion, Maurice tried to video phone Andy, and the system failed, and an error message popped up. And it was the sort of error message written by a programmer for a programmer. And the message referred to the object-oriented system underneath the whole technology. And it read, "Failed to register interest." Now, interpreting the message in a completely different way, Maurice asked me if I knew why Andy didn't want to talk to him. He was very amused when we got to the bottom of it, but I think the lesson was plain, which was to think very carefully about error messages and who might see them. He also gave me some other pieces of wisdom on software over the years. One of them I remember was that computer science was simply the art of drawing boxes with arrows coming out of them. And the second, which echoes something said earlier, is that the best thing you can do, having designed a large, complex piece of software, is to throw it away and design it again, because it will certainly be better than the first. And if you do it a third time, it may even be correct. So the lab was a very social place, a terrific sense of community. Maurice always enjoyed the parties that we had. This is one that we had every year in the summer at Andy's house in Little Shelford. It's one of the very few times you might catch Maurice without a tie, but clearly not on this particular occasion. And it was always nice to see Nina at these occasions. They were clearly a devoted couple. There were many other social occasions too. We had tea and cakes on Tuesday mornings to try and get engineers to talk to each other, varying degrees of zest. But Maurice had a sweet tooth and enjoyed the Fitzbilly sticky buns. So in 1998, here's a photo of the majority of the lab staff. At this time, there was another change in funding, and Oracle became a 50% funder of the lab. And that was arranged really in the space of afternoon with Larry Ellison flying in himself and visiting. We gave him a whistle-top tour of the lab, and no tour of our lab was ever complete without 5 minutes with Maurice. He was always superb with visitors of any kind, whether they were academic, industrial, investors or business types. He always managed to find the right balance of small talk, of industry gossip, of a little old-fashioned British humour thrown in, and it was perfect. And he just started chatting to Larry about planes and helicopters and how he'd enjoyed going in the deck corporate helicopter around Maynard and those places. And he was adventurous. He'd flown with Andy in Andy's plane to many places in the UK and then further afield, and enjoyed those trips very much. He was single-minded about travel. There was once an occasion when he was due to go to Beirut, and it was a time of some trouble and there were bombs exploding. We tried to get him to cancel his trip, but he absolutely refused and said at least if he was going to go, he'd go with a bang. Characteristic of his toughness and determination. For those at the lunch, we've heard the affectionate tribute by the Master of St. John's, but that really was a mutual thing, and Maurice was extremely proud of his connections there over such a long period of time. He would lunch in college every day, he would walk there, or sometimes take the bus, and after lunch he would have a siesta in his college room, and sometime later in the afternoon we would see him back in the lab. He was delighted when St. John's had this portrait commissioned by Hungarian artist Suzy Rabosch, and it hangs there in the small combination room. He was quite flattered to have to go to London a number of occasions for sittings from this young lady. The portrait in the portrait, so it shows a young Maurice with some of the EDSAC equipment, and I think in the sky behind there's some hint towards radio waves in the ionosphere, which was his PhD. EDSAC 99 was an important anniversary. It was the 50th anniversary of EDSAC, and there were substantial commemoration of that here in the lab, and Maurice was delighted to be part of that. And a plaque was unveiled near to where the spot of the original mathematical laboratory was. Here is Nina and Maurice with the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Quentin Skinner there. I helped him a little bit with some of his preparations, and he rehearsed his lectures a few times on me. But what was more interesting was to hear some of the private anecdotes, those things that he felt he couldn't quite repeat in such a public forum. And maybe over the reception later we can talk about some of those. The proceedings were recorded, and I've managed to extract a few bits.
My great chance came when quite suddenly I was invited to attend a course of lectures to be given in Philadelphia by the people who had done this work that I described as seminal. This was my first trip to the United States. Made a great impression on me. In those days it was common for cargo ships to have accommodation for 12 passengers. I travelled on such a ship, but there were 36 passengers, so we were a little crowded. We were all men. There was no doctor aboard, and the shipping company were much worried lest a pregnant woman might be smuggled aboard. And it was the only time in my life in which I had a medical examination directed to determining my sex.
Maurice enjoyed an audience, and he could be very entertaining and quite funny in his own unique way. In 1999, the lab was sold outright, this time to AT&T. As always, Maurice was part of that decision-making process, and his advice and counsel were tremendously important. The acquisition process was helped largely because of Sandy Fraser, who's the person on the far left, who was the AT&T Vice President for Research and had founded AT&T Labs after the divestiture of Lucent and Bell Labs. Sandy had been a graduate student in the computer lab and was awarded his PhD in 1969 on the Titan file system. Again, another exciting era for us, much travel to the US, to AT&T, and many US visitors. And Maurice really loved this element. He loved the American way of life, the American way of doing things. He reminded us not to worry too much about being famous in Cambridge or even in the UK, since in our industry the US matters a great deal. It was a hugely inventive and productive period, and it was great fun for all. Here was one of the projects we delivered in a very short time of joining AT&T. It was the broadband phone, an old-fashioned dumb phone, but with a modern take, state-of-the-art at the time, touchscreen and display, and a thin device, so it just ran a very simple Linux that could boot up in a few seconds, and hey presto, all the applications and the content were in the center, or the cloud as you would probably say now, and it really was a thin client system. Again, we deployed this on large scales, as was our method, and we built 500 of these, including all of the electronics, the software, and the industrial design, with really quite a small team in under a year. And he was an absolutely avid fan of the system. He enjoyed the simplicity of the user interface and of the applications. And we built a mobile device as well, using an off-the-shelf PDA and a Wi-Fi card, but otherwise exactly the same software. And he really liked this mobile concept, the idea of a computer phone in your pocket, as he thought of it. He thought really might catch on. And perhaps it bears a certain similarity to modern devices, I don't know. But we demonstrated this very, very widely, and I was invited to present it at the Royal Society soiree in London and again in Edinburgh. My inclination was to make the exhibition extremely technical, very scientific, very precise for that audience. Maurice said, no, not at all. Make it fun, make it interactive, make it entertaining. And he was absolutely spot on. And it was a huge success. And it's just another of the many examples where I benefit from his experience. I'll try and whiz through. Maurice obviously was an expert on Babbage and used to give lectures. There was a fantastic day in 2001 where he gave a lunchtime lecture in the National Portrait Gallery as part of the Royal Society series. After a lovely lunch with the Royal Society, we actually had a wander around the galleries and found this portrait of Babbage, and it was the first time that he'd seen it, and he was really quite struck by it. And then afterwards, as Maurice was his wont and enjoyed company, we went for dinner at his club in the Athenaeum, and it was just a very memorable day on which Maurice was in absolute top form. The computer lab moved to the West Cambridge site in 2001, which was a fantastic development. Here was a picture of the door at the time, and Maurice was delighted to be part of the proceedings to open this new lab, and this photo was taken at that time. He received many, many prizes and awards over the years, but here are just a few from the period. Fellowship of the ACM, Batten Medal, Von Neumann Medal, and the Fellow of the Computer History, of which Don was one of the founders. These were quite recent awards, invented in the 90s, and he was invariably one of the first people to get nominated for these awards. And you know, the list of other recipients leads like a who's who. But there were a number of prizes that he was especially keen on. One of them was the Kyoto Prize, and this is pictures from the presentation in Japan. This is a very prestigious prize, similar in prestige and stature to the Nobel Prize, but for complementary fields of work. And other recipients from computer and information fields have included people like Jack Kilby and Noam Chomsky and John McCarthy, Donald Knuth and Tony Hoare. The prize itself was a substantial amount of cash, plus an absolutely enormous solid gold medal encrusted with very precious stones. And I remember him bringing it in to the lab when he got back from Japan to show us, not at all in a boastful way, just as you would show friends something that you'd happened across. He was particularly pleased by his Honorary Doctor of Science, which was awarded by the university in 1993, a very rare honour indeed for a member of the university. He considered this to be one of the highest honours he'd come across. And here's a picture clearly as pleased as Punch in his festal gowns. And finally, the recognition that he deserved so richly came in 2000. This was a photograph from the party that we held for him in the AT&T lab, where I remember he quoted Ernest Rutherford, who remarked that everyone should have a lab to work in. Maurice said that he counted himself lucky to have had a lab of one kind or another all of his life. This is a photograph from the investiture some time later, which I think captures Maurice splendidly, and I know it's a photograph that his family are very fond of, and I'm very thankful to Helen for suggesting its use. I've got one final short video clip. It was taken from that XSAT meeting.
Well, when we decided to set up a multiple access system, we needed to have a way of connecting all the users' teleprinter lines to the computer, and that's what this multiplex did. It was a great success. Designed, built in the lab. I thought that the multiplexer, being a rather complicated thing, might get a lot of trouble, but in fact it worked perfectly. Very pleased with it. And I can see that it has been well preserved.
So well preserved indeed, just like Maurice himself. He did work a full day in this period, from 86 through 2002. We saw him with barely a day's illness during that time, and made many valuable contributions to the strategy and culture of the lab. However indestructible Maurice seemed, industrially funded research was not. It's far more vulnerable, and at that time AT&T restructured and we closed the lab down, but not before we tried to sell again, and despite vigorous attempts to find an acquirer, always encouraged by Maurice, consoled, advised, the lab finally closed in April 2002 after 16 years. It's the only time I ever saw Maurice with moisture in his eyes, and it wasn't for himself, it was for the marvellous people and fantastic work of the lab. So after that, Maurice then came to the lab, which is where the story with Andy picks up. But I just want to leave you with my favourite photograph of Maurice, and this was taken sometime in the 90s in our lab. Here he is, surrounded by computer equipment and high-speed digital networking that continued to stimulate his interest over all of these years. His enjoyment at being part of a highly inventive and productive lab with an intensely practical engineering focus, I think, is clear. The sparkle in his eyes, the challenging gaze, and the faintest hint of a wry smile, I think, capture Maurice so brilliantly. I'm very grateful for the influence that Maurice has had on me, and to have been able to count him as a friend. Thank you.